Hey everyone, my name is Ryan and I am a Bible nerd. Recently, in my men's morning Bible study group, the teacher was going to be gone for 2 Wednesdays in a row. He's going on a trip and was just going to be gone for those 2 Wednesdays. And we've been studying the book of Romans, but he asked me to just kind of sub for him during those 2 weeks. I've been stressing to the church and to just members, I'd like more opportunities to teach. I love studying the Bible, I love talking about it. So this gives me an opportunity in kind of a safe environment with this little men's group to do a presentation with them and get some feedback and kind of practice and mess up kind of thing. It was really, really fun. And so I created these slides. I turned them into kind of a part one, part two of the making of the Bible. And after I got done, people were excited about it. They said, hey, you ought to make a recording of it. You ought to put it out there. We want to see the slides and maybe a little audio about it. And some people missed week one or they missed week two or whatever it was. And I thought, well, I've already got the slides, so why not make a video out of it? Why not go through the slides in a video format and be able to just nerd out on this stuff together? So this is part one, the making of the Bible. We'll do part two in the next video. But let's just jump into these slides I created and just nerd out together. So the Bible is a collection of books. It's not one book. And it's a collection that started BC to AD. It spans an incredible amount of time. It was written on 3 different continents. You have 40 plus authors in 3 different languages, and it's anywhere between 66 books to 81 books. And we'll talk about the differences of those numbers as part of this presentation. But I just love studying this stuff. I love nerding out on the Bible. And hopefully you found this channel or found this presentation because you like to as well. So here's some fun facts about the Old Testament. Now, I put the facts in asterisks because these can change over time, and I'll explain that as we go through this, and you'll see why they can change because there can be a new discovery. So the first thing I have here is the oldest verses are actually credited to Song of Deborah that's now recorded in Judges chapter 5. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. If you're an oral tradition kind of society and you start to write things down, the first kind of things you're going to write down are the songs. They're the easiest ones to remember. It just activates a different part of our brain when it's in song. I remember the other day I heard a song I haven't heard for like 10 or 15 years. In fact, when I researched the song, I was surprised how old it actually was, that I remembered the whole thing. As soon as the lyrics kicked in, the tune kicked in, I was able to just sing the whole song. Where if that was a paragraph I had to remember 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't be able to recite it in that way. So there's something about the way that activates the storage mechanism in our brain is just different when it's in song format. And so the oldest verses we have are actually Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5. The other thing is the oldest book is actually Job. Now, in our modern context, when you have a book, chapter 1 to the end is kind of in chronological order, unless there's some sort of, you know, um, looking back or going forward or something like that as part of the story, like a Quentin Tarantino thing where the ends at the beginning and then you work your way backwards, that type of stuff. So there's different literary styles, but generally you open a book, chapter 1 is the start of the story, and the end of the book just works through that progression. Well, the Bible, again, is a collection of books, and they're not in necessarily chronological order. So Genesis does talk about the earliest events, creation in the beginning. I mean, it's definitely talking about that, but when it was actually written and when it was converted and when the earliest stories we have, it actually is the book of Job. Next, the oldest complete book we have is actually Amos, followed closely by Hosea, Micah, and the first 39 chapters of Isaiah. So these are the actual oldest books we have. And if you look at the time frame of when these books were, it's pretty important. So if you notice, this is a time frame right around when the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians. And there's a lot of writings that start happening to process what was going on. You had refugees leaving the northern kingdoms and kind of going to the southern kingdoms, along with this being sent off. So these stories start to get written down more, the oral traditions, they start to contemplate what these meanings were, and you start seeing them start to come together during this time. So it's a very important part. And the next exile, the Babylonian exile, is even more writings come around that particular time frame. So now let's talk about the longest book in the Old Testament. So what would your guesses be? What do you think is the longest book in the Old Testament? Well, some people might say Psalms because there's more chapters and verses in Psalms, but chapter and verse is really more of a modern thing that was added to help us reference and find stories. And there's just amazing amount of work that was put into chapters and verses to break up the scrolls, to make it more readable, findable. In fact, there's even books I've seen now that get rid of chapter and verse, or at least get rid of verses. So it just reads more like a story paragraph form. They're actually pretty cool, especially with Psalms and stuff like that. But that's more of a modern invention, the idea of chapter and verse. But Psalms does have the longest chapter and the shortest chapter in the Old Testament. But based on Hebrew word count, Jeremiah is actually the longest. followed closely by Jeremiah or by Genesis and Isaiah. But the actual longest scroll, the longest by Hebrew word count, is actually Jeremiah. Now, what is the oldest Bible verse that's been found? I thought this was pretty cool. In fact, I have a friend that works in Israel, and he got a keychain that's like a replica of this little scroll that they found. It was almost like a little metal thing that was kind of rolled up and put into like a piece of jewelry that they discovered. And they've got replicas. You can see it online. It's really, really cool. But what verses are they? I wonder if you know that. It's actually Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. This is known as the priestly blessing in Numbers chapter 6. I think it's just beautiful. It's one of the oldest. It is the oldest scroll that we've actually found, is that particular passage. And you see in tradition, in Hebrew tradition, they would have scripture verses, the Shema, Numbers, that they would put into articles of clothing and carry it with them, is the idea you're carrying the word of God with you. So it's a beautiful tradition within the Jewish faith. So the oldest Bible verse found is Numbers chapter 6, and that is verses 24 through 26. Now, what is the most quoted verse in the Old Testament by Old Testament writers? So a modern word is, I don't know if they use this word anymore with X taking over Twitter, but retweeted. Like, what's the most common verse that the Old Testament would use and reuse and hyperlink and recite in the Old Testament? I think this is really, really cool study. So you'll find it in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. It reads this: Yahweh, Yahweh, or the Lord, the Lord. Now, quick comment there. In your Old Testament, if you see Lord in all uppercase, so Lord, all uppercase, this is the divine name given to Moses for God's name, which is most often translated as Yahweh. And what they did is they didn't want people to accidentally say the name in vain or take the Lord's name in vain. So they started using this clue as they were reading the scrolls to switch out the name for Adonai, which is another name for Lord. So it really became a make sure you don't take the Lord's name in vain, as written in the Ten Commandments. They want to make sure you didn't accidentally say the divine name. So how we say this name is up for a lot of interpretation. There's some great videos on YouTube of different ways to interpret that. The most common I hear is Yahweh is what the most common is, which you'll see as YHWH is what you'll see. I even have shirts and hats that say that. I just think is cool, especially when people ask, hey, what does that mean? It gives me a chance to be able to talk to people about what that name meant. But there's some really cool videos about Yahweh that are out there. So it starts off Yahweh, Yahweh, which is translated or changed to Lord, Lord. Lord, Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation. Such deep meaning and such great conversations have been had on that difference of loving, maintaining patience, faithfulness to thousands, yet will not leave the guilty unpunished, and will even have the kids of the kids. So there's really a lot of story, and that's why it's so hyperlinked and so referenced in the Old Testament is these passages. Now, the whole thing's not every single place. You'll have references to it, kind of like we talked about with song. You can name the first couple verses of a song and everybody knows the rest of the song. That's kind of the same thing, as people would reference it, start this verse, and everybody else would be able to finish it for them, knowing that that's what they were trying to reference, that God is slow to anger, compassionate, and just abounding in love and faithfulness. And I think that's one of the things that people miss in the Old Testament is they say, oh, it's a vengeful God, it's a hateful God, it's all this kind of stuff. And you look at it, and there's way more patience. There's way more love in the Old Testament than I think it gets credit for. Now, is there war and other things? Sure, there's definitely things like that. But when you look at the time frame that it's talking about, I mean, even the flood of Noah was 969 years waiting before the flood. There was a prophecy that once this individual had passed on, who's the oldest person in the Bible, then the flood would start. Just that showing the patience and the time it took before even the flood happened. And it just, I don't think the Old Testament God is this angry, vengeful God that so many people reference. When you start reading and understanding it, it's just incredibly beautiful. And again, just another reason I love nerding out on this stuff. So let's talk about some important dates. And again, dates are going to be in italics there because these are going to be dates that either secular or Bible scholars have kind of come up with data within the Bible or outside of the Bible to kind of come up with these dates. So it is not set in stone exactly on Tuesday, June of this BC or whatever it might be. But these are the most generally ideaed dates that we have to work on based on the Bible and other things outside the Bible. So I like looking at these dates because it gives you an idea of the time differences between some of these events. So Adam and Eve would have been 4114 BCE. Noah's flood would have been 2458 BCE. Abraham's story is 2166. You can see kind of the time between the flood and Abraham. Then you have Jacob at 1876. You've got the Moses Exodus story in 1446 BCE. And then you have the earliest known mention of Israel in 1208 BC. And this is really a newer discovery. Like there was a long time that we didn't know how far back. There was all biblical references, so there was no way to really pin it to anything else until we had a outside the Bible source that dates a mention of Israel back to 1208. It's the Merneptah stele, and it's really cool to see this really old, big, it's not a small thing that actually mentions Israel right on that particular artifact. So it's really cool to see a mention of Israel that far back, and hopefully we'll find stuff even further back than that. And then you'll notice on the slide here, 931 is what's now called the start of verifiable. You can see the little italics there, verifiable Bible history, because from this point on, we have more records. Outside sources start to confirm other enemies. I mean, there's a lot more stuff that's starting to come together that is outside of biblical dating and ages and stuff like that. So 931 is a pretty important date because that's the start of, again, quote unquote, verifiable Bible history. And hopefully that'll get pushed back even further. New discoveries are being made. All kinds of really amazing archaeology is being found and discovered that might push that date even further back. But for now, we're at 931. Now, why is 931 such an important date? As you see here, we had the first temple built in 966 BCE, and Solomon's death is in 931 BCE, along with the kingdom split. This is where the Israel kingdom split from the southern tribes and the northern tribes. That's really when that splits. And then you see a period of time where there's kings that rule over both, and they kind of overlap and back and forth, that there's these kings that rule over these two kingdoms until you have the fall of the northern kingdom by Assyria in 760 BCE, which leads into, again, this idea of refugees from the northern kingdom coming down, trying to process what had happened, why they got conquered, that God had left them. And they started to have refugees that were going back into the southern tribes, along with being pulled into Assyria and all over the place. So then you see a time up to King Josiah that there's major religious reforms that start happening in 624. In fact, this is actually recorded in 2 Kings chapter 22, where the king starts to do reform and goes to the temple and starts cleaning out the pagan worship that was happening there and finds a scroll of Deuteronomy. And as he's going through it, realizes how far the Jewish people had fallen away. So it was kind of a revival that was happening. And during this time, you saw a big emphasis of trying to get these scrolls collected and saved and archived and put together. And you really see kind of a big group of writings start to come together during this time. But unfortunately, it's a little too late, because by 586 BCE, the Babylonian exile happens. This is where the first temple is destroyed by Babylon. And you can see even more writings happen about that event. And so many stories are tied to that. In fact, Babylon becomes an archetype throughout the entire Bible of an evil worldly empire. Even Rome is called kind of Babylon of the time, and just shows how much of an impact that had on the people to not only have their temple destroyed, but the harsh exile, the harsh hammer that was laid down during that Babylonian exile. So even the Persian period was actually a lot longer, but the Persians were allowing these people, these conquered people, to return to their homes and practice some of their religious stuff, realizing it's probably better to allow more temperance with that than trying to just be an iron fist over everybody. So there was a sense during that period that they were able to return, able to rebuild Jerusalem, able to rebuild the temple, which then became known as the Second Temple period, starting in 516 BCE. Then you have the Greek period that falls between about 330 to 164. And then later on, you're going to have the destruction of that Second Temple in 70 AD. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in part 2 of this slide. So I wanted to just point out some of these dates, kind of look at some of these, and I just think it's interesting to see it in that order and the time frame between certain events that we read in the Bible. So now let's talk about a couple Bible names you may have heard. So you may have heard the word Pentateuch. You may have heard the word Tanakh. So these are words that describe the collection as these books are starting to come together, what they were called. So the Pentateuch is the first 5 books. That's Pentateuch is number 5 in Greek. It's the idea of the first 5 books of Moses, which also are known as the Torah, which is another word for either law or lessons, teachings. There's a little bit of nuance when it comes to that word. But with Torah, it's most often translated as law. It's the first 5 books of Moses. And these were very important to start collecting these stories to create the Torah. But then there was other writings that were floating around. There was the prophets. There was also the Psalms and Proverbs. There were other collections that were starting to come together. So the word Tanakh is an abbreviation of those 3 different kind of groups of writings. The Torah, the Netavim, and the Ketuvim were the prophets, and the writings is what they called it. So this is what we really call the Hebrew Old Testament, or Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, is this Tanakh, the collection of these 3 different groupings of stories that all come together. A couple other things I wanted to mention here when it comes to like Bible names you may have heard or phrases you might not be familiar with is Masoretic. Masoretic was the effort to make these writings be transcribed, collected over time, and the incredible work that these scribes did to get it correct and to copy, and just make sure they're all correct. In fact, there's even evidence of one scribe right here, one scribe right here, and they would compare to see what the differences were by a third scribe before they officially made that part of the, the copying of these scrolls. The work that was done, the painstaking process to get it right, is just absolutely amazing. And the evidence of how many copies we have of this is really amazing. Like nothing like it in the ancient world when it comes to the volume of collections that we have, and to be able to make sure how right they got it, how correct they got it. And you can see where there is little dashes or tittles or just little differences. You can actually see where it is because you can compare the other versions. And you can actually see where the errors are by seeing what the different versions are. And the work that went into it is amazing. I think in our Western world, we don't believe that the churches didn't have a say, or priests or leaders or kings or pharaohs or whatever it might be that didn't have an influence on this. But when you see the sheer volume of the collection, that's what makes it so immune to human influence. Because even if a king wanted a book written a certain way, he'd have to get to every single copy, destroy all the other copies, not have anything else. I mean, just the sheer volume of it made it protected from the influence of a king or a regime over time. And what makes the books that we have so much more reliable than I think we want to believe or we're taught to believe. And I think it's just incredible how reliable it actually is, while still honoring the fact that it's hard to go from Hebrew or Greek into English. I mean, during my lifetime, the English language has changed, let alone what it would change in meaning or thought for thought translations. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into these things. And the more I've studied it, the more I'm amazed how accurate, how honoring the process really was. And that's the other thing you'll hear once in a while is the term Septuagint. Oh, let me back up one step. So you see there has Masoretic says MT. So when you're reading your Bible, some of your footnotes will have that in the footnotes. And that'll tell you where they got that verse or where they got that translation was from that particular collection of documents. Now, not every Bible is going to have that. It depends on the footnotes that you have, whether it's a reference guide that's helping you more like a study guide to cross-reference other verses or other stories, or whether it is a translation guide that's telling you how they came up with that translation. And some combine that effort. But if you ever see MT, now you'll have a better idea that's where they got that particular translation. That's where the Septuagint also kicks in. So the Septuagint was taking these writings that were in Hebrew and Aramaic and converting them into Greek. And it was very important because Greek was a very common language. The Greek influence was all over that area. There's more people that were able to read and write Greek than any other language up to that particular point. So there's just a lot of reasons that the Hebrew scholars wanted to get these writings into Greek, into a common language of Greek. And they had 70 or 72. So there is some potential that there were 72. But the reason you see LXX and the word Septuagint is tied to the word 70. So there were 70 people involved in getting it right and going through and discussing, okay, what does that mean in Hebrew? Now, what does that mean to us in Greek? And there's some words that just don't translate perfectly. So they're going to have to be able to be flexible on, okay, do we want people to understand what we mean by that saying? So we have to use similar analogies and metaphor, or just the actual word, like the actual words by purest definition. And there's always going to be a balance between those two things to make sure it's still readable and still teaches us what we need to know. So whenever you see MT or LXX in any of your footnotes, now you'll have kind of a better idea of where the basis of that translation actually came from. And the Septuagint was that first translation from the Hebrew Aramaic into Greek, and the New Testament is all written in Greek. So that's why we say that there's three languages involved in the making of the Bible for Christians. Then you have the Apocrypha or Deuterocanon. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. But it's the idea that there was some books that were in between the Old Testament and the start of the New Testament. And this is the word that's associated with that, whether or not you consider that scripture or Bible or whether you don't. So Apocrypha is more the word that Protestants and that type of thing use to describe those books, where Deuterocanon is where the Orthodox and Catholics will call those intertestamental periods between the end of Old Testament and New Testament. So you might have heard that word tossed around a little bit as you've studied the Bible. And the last one I wanted to hit on was called the Vulgate. This is where it takes the Septuagint in Greek and turns it into Latin. So you see this progression of original language translated into common languages and then translated into Latin that we call the Vulgate. It's the Latin version of the Septuagint. So I hope that's helpful, some of those names, some of those terminology. And here's a couple of ones that I think are really cool to look at. You've got some names of some of the ones we still have a copy of. You have the Apello Codex and the Leningrad Codex. These are really cool because they're the oldest copies that we have. The sad thing with the Apello Codex, and you can use Wikipedia or search that, that was the oldest copy that we had. But during the anti-Jewish riots of World War II and all the book burning that was happening, it was captured and not returned until I think 1958. It's amazing we even have a copy of it all. You know, you would think the whole thing would just been destroyed. About 40% of it, I believe, was destroyed. So only 60% is still intact. But it's amazing the whole thing wasn't destroyed. So it was the oldest copy we had that was a complete copy until those riots during World War II. And now the Leningrad Codex is technically the oldest copy that we have. When it comes to Septuagint, the oldest that we have is the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus. And that's not because that's who made it. Like you see Vatican there, you think, okay, the Vatican City made this copy. That's just where it's held. So it's not, it's a Septuagint, but it's in their storage, their museum. It's actually in their keeping. And that's where also the Sinaiticus is actually near Mount Sinai, is where it's stored. Same with the Leningrad is actually where that codex is actually stored in St. Petersburg, Russia. But it's just amazing looking at these old copies that we still have today. And so these are some of the names of the oldest Septuagint, Torah, and the oldest Vulgate that we still have a copy of. So now let's talk about the books of canon. So Protestants, we have 66 books that are 39 of the Old Testament and 27 of the New Testament. In fact, all Christian denominations agree on those 27 books. For Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox, it's where the intertestamental period, that's where you really see the biggest difference. Now with Protestants, the Hebrew Bible and the Protestant Old Testament are the same books. Where you see differences is the ordering. So they might be in different order. And with the Hebrew Bible, they don't split up, say, 1st and 2nd Kings. They don't split up Ezra and Nehemiah. So those are combined into one, where the Protestant numbers systems of dividing those up have just split those into 2 books instead of 1. So that's really where you're going to see the difference. But as far as the name of the books and which ones are both in the Hebrew Bible and the Protestant Bible, those are the same. With Catholics, they've added a few books in between the Deuterocanon. These are some books of the Maccabees. There's some books in between that they count as canon. They also have a little bit of additions to Esther and a little bit of changes to the book of Daniel. So those are their canon within the Catholic tradition. So they have 73 books. Then you have the Orthodox religions of Christianity that take everything from Protestant, everything from Catholic, and even add even more to it. For the Greek Orthodox, they have 3 extra books. And the Ethiopian, they actually have 5 extra, bringing the total to 81 total books. So they took them all. And you can see there's a added to Psalms. There's a there's an addition to 2nd Chronicles with the Orthodox religion. There's a 4th Maccabees that they've actually added that the Catholics don't. And then there's even additions for Baruch, which was the scribe, most likely for Jeremiah. So you see some mentions of him that are part of either Lamentations or Jeremiah. So he was probably a very well respected scribe during some of that time of these books coming together. So there's actually a book accredited to him that the Orthodox religion does call part of their canon. And I think it's important to know there is a difference with that, that there is an effort to make sure these books can stand up to scrutiny, that there is historical relevance, there's enough copies of it. There's a lot of reasons why these books became canonized even before the churches and the kings and all the rulers that could have been there. And even some of the councils and stuff like that are really much after the collection of these started coming together, especially when it comes to the Old Testament. So I thought that was useful. I thought it was really fun to kind of go through those different books. And so on our next presentation, we're going to dig a little more into some fun Bible stuff. We're going to talk a little bit more about the New Testament, and then we're going to get into a little bit more about the Bible translation history, how we go from Septuagint and Greek and Latin into English, and some of the history of getting the Bible that we now have for English speakers and a lot of the world is through the King James Version, and just some of that history that talks about the translation of the Bible itself. So I hope you found this useful. I really enjoy studying this. Let me know what I got right, what I got wrong as I went through the presentation. But I thought it was a fun opportunity to be able to be in front of a safe group and kind of play with this idea and come up with the graphics. And I really am trying to get better at this type of stuff. And this was just a great opportunity. And everybody said, hey, you ought to make it a recording. I already had the slides. So why not make it a video for the YouTube channel? And hopefully you like it. Please like, subscribe to the video, to the channel. I'm trying to put out new content and have all kinds of different fun ideas when it comes to nerding out on the Bible. So hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you on the next video.